Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this session of the Bad Sydney Crime Writers Festival. This session, as you've seen, is entitled Crime Rates Are Down, but Prisons Are Full. And before we get into that very interesting discussion that is about to happen, I expect, there are some housekeeping matters that I'm obliged to give to you as the host of this session. You are obviously very interested in crime. I should tell you that in case you hadn't worked it out, my name's Nick Cowdery, and I was the Director of Public Prosecutions for New South Wales for over 16 years. And I've spent, I calculated, 52 years in criminal justice one way or another, so I've seen a bit of crime. And I'm very happy to share my experiences if that should become relevant during the discussion. I'll move to our guest a little later, but first these housekeeping announcements. There are some joining us on Zoom through the camera at the back of the room, and we welcome you, Zoomers, as well as the people who are here in person. There are some who may be watching from your local library. Libraries are extremely important in the community, as we all know, and the local libraries are enabling attendance at this conference as well. We acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of this land and pay respect to their elders past and present. As you have already seen, we are following COVID protocols. We're all double vaxxed, some of us may be triple vaxxed. We've all checked in with QR codes, and we should keep our masks on except when eating or drinking, or in the case of speakers, when we're on the stage. So that will be the procedure followed right through the event. Social distancing means there are restricted numbers in the room, so please try to respect the protocols. Hand sanitizer is available just outside the door, as you probably saw, and please let a volunteer know if you feel unwell. Please mute your mobile phones and don't record the session. And if you are taking photographs, heaven help us, please turn off the flash. A couple of old faces up here, I'm not sure that you really want them in your camera. Feel free to share on social media, whatever that is. There's something called @BadCrimeSydney, and there's something else called #BadCrimeSydney. If that means any sense to you, go for it. We will keep about 15 minutes at the end for questions after the conversation between Don and myself. If you're joining us on Zoom or through the libraries, please send your questions through using the chat function on the Zoom screen at least 20 minutes before the end of the session, so that's by 4:10. And we'll do our best to include those questions amongst others that our audience here may have. So, that leads me to the very pleasant task of introducing Professor Dr. Professor Dr. Don Weatherburn, PSM. You all know. Don was the Director of the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research for nearly 30 years, from 1988 to 2019. He's now a professor at the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre at the University of New South Wales. And the book that we are focusing on this afternoon, entitled The Vanishing Criminal, wish that was so, but we'll find out why it's not actually happening that way, is Don's fourth book. I'm just going to mention the other three because they're a fantastic read and they give you a huge amount of information about crime in our society. The first he wrote in 2001, Delinquent-Prone Communities. The second, Law and Order in Australia, Rhetoric and Reality, published in 2004. Fantastic book that looks at the cause and prevention of crime and factors that contribute. And the third book, Arresting Incarceration, Pathways Out of Indigenous Imprisonment, published in 2014. A very important book looking at the situation of First Nations people in our criminal justice processes, and a book which, I regret to say, appears not to have been read by any politician. We do try. The Vanishing Criminal, as I said, published this year, is Don's fourth book, co-authored with Sarah Rahman. You may have seen Don on the SBS program Incarceration Nation, where he spoke about the First Nations representation in our criminal justice system, and he has been the subject of, I just showed him a moment ago, when this book came out, Ross Gittins, of great stature in our society, in my submission, gave a very favourable review in his column in the Sydney Morning Herald. Don has also written about these issues for the Judicial Officers Bulletin, and he and I both took part in a Productivity Commission webinar a few weeks ago, following the report of the Productivity Commission's, the publication of the Productivity Commission's report on prisoners in Australia, and touching on the sorts of issues that Don mentions in his book and that we'll be discussing this afternoon. So, with that introduction, I'm just making a few introductory observations into the matters that Don will be discussing. He refers in the book to a number of categories of crime that have been falling over the last couple of decades at least, not just in New South Wales but around Australia too. One of them is homicide. Now, I know from prosecution experience that the rate of murder in New South Wales has hovered around about 80 to 120 a year for about the last 100 years. But we're seeing that number go down. And Don puts it down in his book to the reduction in the number of guns in the community after the Port Arthur massacre and the measures that were taken then. And interestingly, and this is something that you wouldn't necessarily first think of, the improvements that have been made in emergency medical treatment, which have meant that some people who might otherwise have died from wounds are saved. And it's a contributor to a reduction in that category of crime. Assaults have been going down, maybe because of reduced alcohol consumption by young people. You know, with drink driving laws and all of that sort of thing, there has actually been a reduction in the level of alcohol consumed by the younger age group. Thefts have gone down. We've tightened up our pawnbroking laws, and we have seen a fall in demand for stolen goods. All the previously stolen items, now you can probably get so cheaply at Harvey Norman that you don't need to go out and steal them. So that has been a contributor. Robbery is down. Why? We're not carrying the amount of cash that we used to carry once upon a time. Everything's on the plastic these days. And of course he mentions the ageing population, guilty, and the better economic circumstances that society generally has been enjoying in recent times. So I've left out a few things so that Don's still got something to talk about. We're just getting started. So looking at that title for the session this afternoon, crime rate is down but imprisonment is up. The first question that many of you might ask is, well, is there a causal relationship between those two circumstances? So I'm going to start the ball rolling by asking Don this. In the book, Don, you say that crimes like break and enter, car theft and robbery have dropped between 40 and 80% since 2001. So we're looking at the last 20 years. You also say that imprisonment rates have risen by more than 40% since 2001. So how much, if at all, is the rise in imprisonment contributing to the fall in crime?
Not much, although I have to tell a crime writers group that I got into research on crime because I failed as a crime novelist. I went to a Greek island called Paros.
You want to use
wrote 40 pages of absolute drivel. Can you hear me?
What about the Zoom?
Right. So I just couldn't resist telling, because you're my heroes, I couldn't resist telling you. Is this working?
Yeah.
Okay. That little bit first. But since I'm incompetent at writing crime novels, I can only read them. I'll try and answer next question. The short answer is it didn't contribute very much at all. And the easy reason to understand is that the big reduction in crime happened in Australia between 2000 and about 2008-9. The big increase in imprisonment happened between 2008-9 and the present. So the increase in imprisonment, most of it happened after the drop in crime. But for those of you who like a more precise answer, roughly speaking, the evidence suggests that every 10% increase in the likelihood of going to jail, it reduces crime by about 1%. So if you apply that to the jump in imprisonment rates, you end up with the conclusion that between 1 and 6% of the drop in crime was attributable at most to the increase, the drop in crime was attributable to the increase in the likelihood of going to jail. When we conducted a study on the length of the prison term, we found no effect at all. And the reason for that is that most people who've committed serious offences get out when they're on the end tail of their criminal career. Most of them are about to stop anyway, so around about 40 years of age, the likelihood of continuing involvement in crime starts to drop pretty rapidly. So there's not a lot of gain in keeping people in jail for a lot longer, except of course those people who are repetitively violent and shown over a long period that they would continue to offend if released. So there are a small group of people, I think most of us who are old enough will remember some of the cases, who probably should be kept in prison for a lengthy period of time just because of the risk. But they're a tiny minority. The vast majority are in for property crimes or less serious crimes. Their problem is they just keep doing it. And there are probably better ways of dealing with that problem than simply locking them up. Should I have gone on?
You can if you wish.
No, I'll try to be brief. I'm trying to avoid mentioning statistics because I know you'll all walk out.
You've sort of touched on, although not spoken about, the connection between imprisonment and criminal offending. There's a lot of discussion that has occurred about whether or not heavier punishments deter people from criminal offending. Your book makes some observations about all that. Would you like to talk about that for a bit?
Yeah, let me first distinguish between, I imagine many of you know this, but between what's called specific deterrence, which is the effect of a penalty on the person who's offended, whether it increases or reduces their likelihood of reoffending, and general deterrence, which is the effect that punishing offenders has on the general proclivity to offend, even amongst those who haven't yet offended. So the evidence in relation to specific deterrence is basically that it doesn't seem to work at all. There are very, very few studies which have found any effect. Those that have found an effect have found one in a very specific set of circumstances. For example, the Italian Parliament some time ago let 222,000 people out of prison because there was a prison amnesty and the prisons were over. This would only happen in Italy. Be very interesting if they tried it in Australia. But 223,000 or 2,000 people got let out. And the condition was, if any of them offended, they had to serve the balance of their term back in prison plus any additional punishment. Now, the really interesting thing about this from a researcher's point of view is that the length of time you have left to serve if you offend is completely random. It depends only on when you came into prison. It doesn't depend on your characteristics or anything like that. And they found a very small effect, a very small specific deterrent effect amongst those who had longer to serve, but it was of the order of 1 to 2%. So far as general deterrence is concerned, there is some evidence that prison reduces crime, but again, as I mentioned, it's around about the 1 to 2%, so a 10% increase in prison reduces crime by about 1 to 2%. And most of that effect appears to come from what's called incapacitation. And what I mean by that is that while you're locked up, you can't offend. So for example, if you're a burglar doing, as the average burglar was back in 2000, doing 8 to 10 burglaries a month, you multiply that by 12, and you multiply that by the number of people in prison, you do get a measurable reduction. But if you're talking about drug trafficking, for example, as soon as one person gets arrested, somebody else steps into their shoes. So it's only a benefit for some sorts of crimes and not really a measurable benefit in a larger scheme of things. Is that reasonably clear? I hope I'm not talking too quickly about this.
One of the other things that might have some impact on offending, I suppose, is the policing of society. The number of police and the way that they operate. And you say that in the book that the number of police per head of population in Australia has risen significantly since 2001, where lots of things have been happening in the last 20 years. So did the appointment of more police help bring down the crime rate?
Well, it may have. There's been no study in Australia of the effectiveness of appointing additional police. There have been 2 or 3 in the United States, and they have found positive effects, not dramatic, but positive effects. Probably what matters far more than the number of police is what they do, and in connection with what they do, whether they're corrupt. So, for example, and I kid you not, it's no surprise that during the 1970s, 80s and 90s, New South Wales was struggling to control crime. And in my view, one of the main reasons for that is that the police were corrupt and heavily involved in organised crime. And that became clear in the Wood Royal Commission, and it's become clear in other jurisdictions that have had serious problems of police corruption. After the Wood Royal Commission, there was a major change in the way police operated. One of them was that they were held individually accountable, or local areas were accountable for reducing crime in their area. So no longer was it the case that the release of crime statistics was a public relations exercise and all the local area commanders could just watch it on TV. If you now want to ring up and find out what's happening in your area, you can ring the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research and find out what streets have got a problem. So enormous pressure was placed on police to manage the crime in their area, and I'll come in a minute to what they were doing that might have been effective. The second thing is that in other states in the United States where they've done this, the police simply started lying about crime statistics. I don't mean to convey too much cynicism here. The difficulty for them in Australia is that the Australian Bureau of Statistics, which is a federal government agency, runs a national crime victims survey. This is a representative sample of the population that are asked whether they've been victims of burglary or motor vehicle theft or assault or robbery. So there's an independent check. The second thing is that the Bureau, my former office, acquired responsibility, and we're not, or weren't, and still aren't, part of the police department. So the police had no direct control over the crime statistics. So the confluence of those two things, increased responsibility, increased accountability, led them to start looking at what actually works to reduce crime. And some of the things that they adopted, you might think are so obvious you'd wonder why they didn't do it before, which is developing computer programs that would enable them to go to crime hotspots at hot times. So they would check their data and they would find out that there are problems of assault between, let's say, 4 in the afternoon and 3 in the morning in King's Cross or in Terry Hills or wherever else. And they would send their resources through there to try and preempt that. And that turned out to be very effective. It also works for burglary. There are some areas which have got big problems with burglary. So simply having police around, the would-be burglar looks at the situation and thinks too risky. So that sort of thing has a deterrent effect. You don't need to arrest anybody. You just need to be present when there's an opportunity for crime and no one otherwise would be looking. So I think that's been very effective. Other things that have been effective, I'll try not to go on too long, Nick, is weapons confiscation. That certainly reduced the number of knife attacks. You might remember we were going through a plague of knife attacks at one stage. They managed to deal with that. But there are also some important things about regulation, but I'm going to save those because I'm hoping Nick will ask me about them.
Well, we'll come to those. Not just yet. The police also have something called a clear-up rate that they talk about at great length. Your book reports that the clear-up rate, that is well, you can tell us what it means, but that it also went up in this period. Did that make a difference to things?
Well, look, first you've got to be wary with clear-up rates. One of the favourite ways in which police have to increase the clear-up rate is get somebody they've arrested for one offence to admit to 4 or 5 others. And that will artificially increase the clear-up rate without changing the risk of arrest whatsoever. So most people think of the clear-up rate as the percentage of offenders that get caught. Well, that would be nice if it was, but often what happens is they'll get one offender and they might have the offender evidence for one offence, but they'll do a deal and say, well, if you admit to these other 4, we won't prosecute you or charge you so heavily. Having said all that, the risk of detection is a very important factor in decisions to commit what I'd call predatory crime. By predatory, I mean crimes committed for gain. Crimes committed, for example, on the internet to get money or to do burglary or to do robbery, as distinct from an assault, which is very often an alcohol-fueled response without any thought to the consequences. So the risk of arrest is a very important thing. I just think you need to be careful when looking at clear-up rates and not assuming automatically that when they go up, you've got an increased risk of detection. Did they contribute to the drop in crime? Absolutely they did. Certainly our evidence suggests that the effect police had in raising the clear-up rate had quite a significant effect in reducing the crime rate. Not the only effect in reducing the crime rate from 2000 forward.
I'm getting the impression that the criminal justice enforcement and adjudication process hasn't played a terribly important role in reducing crime. Is that right as a general proposition?
It is. Look, it's made a contribution, but it's not by any means the major reason for the drop in crime. As Nick, when he happily preempted everything I was going to tell you, said, or to quote Nick Cowdery, as Nick Cowdery says, you know, I feel like I'm echoing somebody. There was a huge drop in the cash carrying. That was very bad for robbers. A robber, by the way, is somebody who steals with threat or violence, not to be confused with a burglar who sneaks in and doesn't threaten anybody. So robbery was preeminently an offence committed by people who are drug dependent, and it was good because it produced cash. Any other kind of crime, for example, break and enter or car theft, you've got to sell the stuff. And I'll come back to that later on, I hope. Or Nick will come back to that later on. But yes, that's certainly, I should explain. The reduction in cash carrying, the reduction in alcohol consumption was a big factor in the drop in assault, which didn't happen until 2008. And there are many other, I better be quiet because you may have other questions.
Well, we've plenty to come back to. All right, now you've explored some rather unusual ideas in your book about possible contributors to the reduction in crime. At least I thought some of them were a bit unusual. One of them was abortion. Now, making a link between the availability of abortion and the commission of crime, I thought was a little bit of a stretch. Maybe we need to be looking out here since it was decriminalised in New South Wales in 2019. But how does, it's an idea that a number of other commentators and researchers have floated from time to time. What's your take on that one?
Well, has anybody here read Freakonomics? Right, okay, so this idea was put forward first by Stephen Levitt of Freakonomics and Super Freakonomics fame. And the basic argument was unwanted children are more likely to get involved in crime, and the advent of abortion, legalised abortion, meant there are fewer unwanted children, and he has a complicated statistical analysis which ostensibly checks that. First off, it's important to point out it has no real relevance to Australia because the timing is all wrong. Had it been the case, the advent of the pill or the advent of abortion been a major issue here, we would have seen crime dropping in the 80s. Well, it was roaring up in the 80s, it wasn't dropping at all. In the US, he's been taken to task by a number of other people who have said that, without getting into all the statistical complexity of it, there are other easier explanations for the drop in crime coincident with abortion, one of which is the reform of US police crime statistics. They, like New South Wales, had major problems with their crime statistics, and people have said if you look at the American US crime victimisation survey, you don't see the effect he's talking about. But I don't think it has any relevance to Australia.
I've mentioned it before, but what about the population ageing? You've said that most crooks are probably going to grow out of their offending anyway by the age of about 40 or thereabouts, except for the hard-nosed ones who keep on going, and they're in a minority. Has crime fallen just because the population generally is ageing?
It has. Well, certain kinds of crime have fallen, so burglary, motor vehicle theft, robbery have fallen in part because just there are fewer young people out there. It's a tragedy. People like us now rule the world.
If only, yes.
So there are fewer young people, and it has made a contribution. It's certainly not the major contributor. I mean, there is, let's face it, there is no major contributor. There are different factors affecting different offences at different times, but there's no doubt that the drop in the, or I should say the ageing of the population is having a beneficial effect. Whether it'll stay that way, I don't know, because older people tend to be better at fraud, which is one of the growth areas of crime. So you lot would know perfectly well how to get on the internet and make some money. And it remains to be seen even whether the so-called blue-collar crimes of motor vehicle theft and break and enter will stay down. Robbery seems to be making its way back up again. I suspect they're stealing credit cards for use on the internet, but we'll have to wait and see whether that's the case.
Now here's another one, unleaded petrol.
I know you're
there
all
are some, I mean, this
You have not heard the beginning of this.
it's all in here. It's all. I'm not making this up. It is in
Anybody want to guess why unleaded petrol would have helped reduce the crime rate? I can see a head nodding. Shoot.
Brain damage.
Sorry?
Less brain damage.
That's right.
brain
that's the
brain
idea.
damage for those on Zoom.
So unleaded petrol, or lead, has quite devastating effects on impulse control and things like that. So it's certainly a reasonable hypothesis that around lead smelters, but again in Australia the timing is wrong. Most of the lead went out as a result of unleaded petrol rather than restrictions on lead manufacturing, and had that been responsible for the drop in crime in Australia, you would have seen it earlier than you actually saw it. The second problem is that people who have low impulse control have trouble controlling impulses for any kind of crime. Well, one of the problems you see with that is that sexual assault didn't decline, it's still going up. Assault didn't decline until 2008. Burglary and motor vehicle theft declined back in 2000. So this sort of staggered dropping in crime just doesn't seem to fit too well with the lead level hypothesis.
Another theory that has been argued by some and that you don't put a lot of store by is that improvements in psychiatric treatment have reduced crime.
You know, it's funny, everybody wants to own the crime drop. No one wanted to own the increase in crime. Even the criminologists were saying it wasn't real. So the idea here, and I assure you it's not my idea, was that there have been big improvements, as many of you will know, in psychiatric treatment, psychiatric medication, compared with, say, back in the 60s. And these medications are much better at moving people back to a fairly stable state where instead of being persecuted by their hallucinations and acting out serious crimes as a consequence. But the big problem with this theory is that the psychiatric medications we're talking about were developed long ago, have been in for 20 or 30 years now, and crime didn't start dropping, particularly the violent crimes didn't start dropping till 2008. So again, the timing is wrong with that sort of hypothesis. I'm not suggesting for a moment there weren't people who might otherwise have committed a crime were it not for their treatment, but in the broad scale of things, in terms of contributing to the overall reduction in crime, I don't think it's been a big issue.
In our community, heroin has come and gone. There have been peaks and troughs in the availability and the use of heroin over time. Has that been a contributor to crimes?
What do you think, Nick?
Well, no.
Well, I think he's right. No, actually it has been. It was a significant trigger. Around about, does anybody know about the heroin shortage? Should I explain? Yeah, okay. So in the 80s and 90s, well, basically since the Australia was involved in Vietnam, after the Americans came here for R&R, rest and recreation, they brought heroin with them, and the heroin epidemic really got a foothold in Australia and started to build through the 60s and 70s and thereafter. And the peak for the overdose rate was around about 1999, 2000. That was when heroin was in full swing. And young kids were all getting addicted. I remember talking to ambulance drivers in southwestern Sydney about the scale of the problem they were dealing with, and it was huge. Then at Christmas 2000, suddenly the heroin overdose rate dropped, and no one believed it. They thought it was an aberration. Then the following year, it dropped even more. And within 2 years of 2000, by 2002, the heroin overdose, the fatal overdose rate had dropped by 60%. And most people think that this is largely because Australia had forged a closer relationship with Southeast Asian countries, and have managed to interdict the supply of heroin. But that's another story. What matters is that suddenly a whole lot of people who are dependent on heroin couldn't get the heroin without paying a large amount of money, and even when they couldn't, well, they did manage to get it. As one described it to me, it's shit. I mean, I wouldn't want to try it. It wasn't any good. So there was a mass migration of young people into methadone, which is the standard treatment at the time. And as soon as that happened, the burglary rate dropped, the motor vehicle theft rate dropped, the robbery rate dropped. So that was kind of the trigger. But within 3 or 4 years, the heroin overdose rate plateaued at a lower level. And this is why I don't think the heroin epidemic or the heroin shortage is the main reason. Because after that, burglary and motor vehicle theft and robbery, all these offences kept on going down. Even though heroin was now available, not terribly good, very expensive, but not dropping anymore, the crime rate kept on dropping further. So my take on that is that it was the trigger, an important trigger, but certainly not the only factor that was involved.
You've mentioned the American servicemen bringing heroin in during the Vietnam War in the late 60s. That's where I got started in crime.
Would you like to explain that a bit more?
Yeah. I thought perhaps I should. I was actually working in the Commonwealth Deputy Crown Solicitor's Office still as a law student in the late 60s, and working in the preparation of the briefs against these servicemen who were bringing heroin into King's Cross and getting caught on their way in, usually, when they were searched. And they were here, of course, for rest and recreation, or what we call rape and revenge. So that was my introduction to crime, actually. Right. It was right back at the very beginning.
I'm so glad you weren't dealing.
No. We're trying to deal with the consequences, and it convinced me fairly quickly that criminalising the possession and use of drugs is a pretty futile exercise, and I've maintained that view ever since. So there we go. Well, all right. I think we've sort of touched on alcohol use. Nothing more to say about that.
Well, there's something interesting to say about that.
Yep.
Has anybody got any thoughts on why people stopped using alcohol? Or I shouldn't say they stopped using it. they reduce their consumption of it. Any thoughts on that? Sorry? Breathalyzers. Well, that was when they're driving. Does the word ecstasy spring to mind? Cheaper, more fun, makes you warm and friendly. Doesn't interfere with your driving, or so they think. I don't know, I've never tried it. I'm past that point. But that may be one of the reasons. Certainly it got a lot more expensive because of the Alco-Pops tax. Do you remember the Alco-Pops tax? So that discouraged a lot of people who are less wealthy to switch from alcohol to other things. The federal government left a gaping hole there briefly. Manufacturers started producing I think these fizzy drinks that were kind of beer-based, but they closed that loophole. So there's been a steady increase in the real price of alcohol over a long period, and it's had a big effect on young people's drinking, not so much older people, wealthy people like yourselves who can afford to buy fine wine. And nobody's disagreeing.
We're just thinking about wine.
Yes, right.
All right. Well, now, a couple of fairly obvious ones, I suppose. Improvements in household and vehicle security, and there's some very interesting matters reported in your book about those.
Yeah, the British think that the drop in burglary, you may or may not know that this drop in crime has happened not only in Australia but in the UK and the US and a lot of Western European countries. The Brits think, or British researchers think, that the drop in burglary in the UK is as a result of better security. I spoke to the NRMA about this and asked them if they could send me any data on the levels of security. Apparently none of you have electronic alarms, is that right? No, you do? You don't? Right. Do you have deadlocks? Have you got double glazing? Have you got bars on your windows? Oh, well, you're all history. No, you see, this is why I don't put much store by it. I mean, when I arrived in the house I'm currently in, every window was barred. I just removed all the bars, and the neighbour said, "You'll be sorry." And I have never had a problem. And the reason, I think, is that burglary is a much smaller problem here than it was there. But I also think the problem with burglary these days is the difficulty of selling the goods. Once upon a time, you could go in with a big fat colour TV, and you could go down to the local pub and ask if anybody wants to buy it, and then you go out back and swap it. But imagine trying to sell a colour TV now. I mean, for one thing, they're so damn big you can't get them out of the house. For another thing, stereos were popular. Who's got a stereo here? Ah, well, I'm one too, so. But I mean, you know, they're now in your mobile phone with earphones, and that's always on you, so it's got to turn into a robbery to get it. The other thing they used to like is CDs. Anybody got any CDs? Oh, you two up the back. We need to talk afterwards. What are some of the other things they used to like stealing? PlayStations, do they still exist? No? And they go out of date so fast it doesn't matter anyway. And then there are those things that they really used to like that you, not Walkmans, what are they called, where you used to have a gadget that you'd stick your microphone in and... MP3? So all these things are gone, so there's just no joy. This is what I think is a better explanation than household security. But I will say one thing about security, and that's to do with regulation. You know, for a very long time, the penalties for break and enter just went up and up and up and up and had no effect whatsoever on the incidence of break and enter. And then the police suddenly got it into their heads, I don't know where they got the idea, that maybe people were selling stolen goods to pawnbrokers, second-hand dealers. You imagine.
They're smart. They're smart.
Anyway, after thinking about this for a while, they thought, well, maybe we should put these pawnbrokers online so we can see their transactions. And I was present when the first batch of results came through, and there are guys walking into pawnbrokers with 40 power drills. And they would do this every month, and they'd get cash for them, no questions asked. So it was an extraordinary opportunity. So what helped reduce the burglary rate in New South Wales in particular dramatically was putting the transactions online so police could actually see what was going on. I'll tell you another brilliant idea they had, and that was to make sure that if you sold a power drill, you had proof of ownership. That's novel. but it seemed to discourage thieves. After that, they got onto the idea of having receipts for goods and things like that. So, look, I don't mean to be too cynical. I just think people massively underestimate the importance of regulation. We had a huge problem with assault. We still have a big problem with violence. But the first thing that government, in my experience in 30 years, ever did that succeeded in reducing the assault rate was restricting the liquor outlet laws. I mean, I'm not talking about the lockout. I'm just talking about restricting the trading hours of licensed premises that were repeatedly the site of assault. This was a Labor Party initiative. But most of the things they've done to liquor licensing have had beneficial effects. So it's, again, a regulation. You can threaten people with 3 strikes and you're out, but there's very little chance that's going to have anything like the effect of simply making it harder to get a drink at 3 in the morning. I'm sorry for those of you who love to drink at 3 in the morning. I'm one of them. Over to you, Nick.
Well, you said you'd come back to regulation, and you've done that. Thank you. What about motor vehicles?
I'm glad you asked that. So this was another scam. I mean, there are 2 groups of motor vehicle thieves. One group are the professional thieves who strip the car and sell the parts and often send it offshore. But the majority of motor vehicle thieves are young people who want to go for a joyride or want to commit a crime with the car, as a stolen car and so on. Now, what used to happen is that people would steal these motor vehicles, sell them on to other people who would then go to a motor auction, and people whose cars had been smashed as a result of an accident, they would buy these cars at a premium price. They were never drivable, but they were highly desirable to organised crime because on the motor vehicle there's a thing called a compliance plate. That's a certification that this is a registered car. So they would take the smashed car, take the compliance plate off and stick it on the stolen motor vehicle. So, and of course, this is one of those moral hazard situations. No one was complaining. The insurance companies were delighted that they could sell wrecked cars for huge sums of money. They must have known what was going on here. But it took the best part of 10 years for the government to change the law so that you couldn't simply walk into one of these auctions, take one of their wrecked vehicles, take the compliance plate and stick it on your vehicle. So again, it's another case where regulation made it much more difficult to steal cars. The second thing was that they required motor vehicle manufacturers to spray vehicle parts with microdots. These are tiny little dots that you can't scrape off that have the details of the car. So you couldn't strip the parts and sell the parts without people being able to find out where the parts came from. So that was another important contributor. Am I running out of time here?
No, you're doing
I've already lost one. I don't want to lose any more.
But no, it does bring us to question time, though.
Oh, good.
Yeah, so there's an opportunity for you to stick a few more things in, I'm sure, between now and 4:30. The rules say that you're not allowed to have microphones, I'm sorry, because you're all diseased and you might pass on something that we don't want to have. So if you ask a question, please keep your voice up. Might help if you sort of lowered the mask for the moment as well while you do it so we can hear you. And I will have to repeat the substance of any questions for our Zoom audience, so don't be alarmed if you think that I'm just being a nuisance. So, yes, madam. The question is whether or not there's a difference between men and women in the commission of crime and incarceration.
Well, there's certainly a difference in crime. That's no surprise. There's certainly a difference. The incarceration rate of women has gone up even faster than that of men. And we didn't talk much about this, but there are 2 primary drivers. Several things have happened to push the prison population up. I didn't talk about this before. One of them was the increase in methamphetamine use. So there's been a huge increase in methamphetamine use. That doesn't matter so much because not many people get locked up for that. But methamphetamine trafficking has also gone up, or at least the number of people caught for methamphetamine trafficking has gone up. And this has affected men and women involved in dealing. They're not the big fish, but they will get a jail sentence if they're caught for dealing, especially if it's a large quantity. The second thing that's pushed it up is the but the child sexual assault revelations. So a lot more of that has come to light and has entered the criminal justice system. So there's been a big increase in people turning up. I don't think this has affected women. I think this is mainly men as always, involved in this offence. But the third thing that's pushed it up is tougher sentences, and this has affected both men and women. So if you're picked up for an assault, for example, you are much more likely to get a jail sentence now than you were, say, even 5 years ago. And the same is true of most of the major categories of crime. The proportion of convicted offenders who get a jail sentence has gone up. It's not entirely clear whether this is because police have been targeting repeat offenders, and repeat offenders are inherently more likely to go to jail than non-repeat offenders, or whether it's because the courts have got simply tougher with the same categories of offence. But those are two of the reasons. I guess a last one, and this also affects women as much as men, is police strategy under the Suspect Target Management Plan, some of you might have heard of. It's a particular strategy police have employed to try and keep crime down, is to target people who are on conditional release. And what I mean by that is the courts have, say for example in the case of bail, have released the person under certain conditions, or they've been convicted and given a community sentence which has certain conditions attached to it. So what police have been doing is watching these people very closely, and the moment they breach, I don't mean commit a further offence, just breach the conditions of the release, they're back before the court arguing that the person needs to be either sentenced to given a prison sentence or refuse bail. And that's also had a big put upward pressure on the prison population for men and women.
The other contributor to the prisoner numbers is the number of people who are bail refused as a consequence of the total mess that the government has made of the Bail Act. It's now the case that 30%, or just over 30% of prisoners in New South Wales are in jail on remand, bail refused. They haven't been convicted of anything, they haven't been sentenced to anything, but they're in prison. And that has been rising steadily, I think, since about 2014, when the final abomination was made to the Bail Act. So that's a big contributor. And I guess another thing, you talk about heavier sentences, Don, but there is a pretty high number of prisoners in prison for sentences of 6 months or less, short sentences. And a sentence of 6 months or less is totally useless. It's just warehousing people in particularly bad company to learn bad things about their behaviour, which they then practice when they're released. You can't put somebody through an effective prison program, therapeutic, educational, drug and alcohol, sex offender, whatever it might be, within that 6 month period. It's just not possible. So they get no benefit from being locked up, and in fact they become worse. And the rate of recidivism, which we haven't mentioned, is over 50%. What that means is that more than 50% of people coming out of prison will be under corrections control again within 2 years. So there is a real revolving door on our prisons at the moment. I just thought I'd get those little speeches in somewhere. There was a hand.
There's a hand up there.
Hand 1, 2.
Yeah.
Okay. Don's going to talk about recidivism and rehabilitation programs. That's for the Zoom audience.
Yeah. Okay, so the recidivism thing, recidivism rates have, I almost stumbled on that. Recidivism rates, I got that, have gone up. But here's the thing. Think about the offender population as being made up of two groups. A small group of persistent offenders, typically they start their involvement in crime or their antisocial behaviour starts in school. They have often children who have been neglected or abused, so they start early and they finish very late. And they're a minority, maybe 5 to 6% of the total offender population. Then you have a large group of offenders who offend when there's an opportunity, particularly in their teenage years, late teenage years, early 20s. What seems to have happened since 2000 is that large group of casual, opportunistic offenders has shrunk dramatically. But there's still the same number of persistent offenders. Now, if you think about the recidivism rate, when it was a mixture of people who didn't reoffend, a large group of them, and a small group who did reoffend, and you remove the group that hardly ever reoffend, you're left with people who are persistent offenders. So I don't think people have become more likely to offend. I think there are simply fewer people in the casual category, people who would see a car unlocked and say, oh, you know, grab that, or people who would see an unlocked house and think, I'll go and take the colour TV. So as to the second part of your question, yes, there are plenty of programs that are effective in reducing reoffending. In Australia, for example, the drug court program is very effective. In the United States, there's a place called the Washington State Institute for Public Policy, and it has a particular bulletin which goes through all of the programs that have been found to be successful in reducing reoffending. Maybe the quickest way for you to get hold of the details of that is to go on the Campbell Collaboration website, CAMPBLL, collaboration. Just Google it, and there you've got all of what's known reliably about reducing crime. So there's certainly a lot of cost-effective alternatives to reducing crime. We just finished a study looking at electronic monitoring for people, and as long as it's coupled with rehabilitation measures, and by that I mean not to be vague about rehabilitation, teaching people how to control their impulses, teaching them how, helping them deal with their drug and alcohol problems. Sorry? Teaching them to read, increasing their employment opportunities and so on. I mean, all of these things help to reduce the incentives for involvement in crime, and yes, they are effective. The only other thing I'd add is it's a great pity in Australia we don't evaluate more of this, because whenever you go to politicians to say, look, you should adopt this, the problem is always the same. There isn't enough evidence in Australia. New South Wales is good, the other states are shocking. So they keep reinventing the wheel.
Of course, we also need the political will to put the resources into the rehabilitation programs that have been shown to work, and that's another hurdle. The question is one about the terminology we use to describe offences. The one-punch attacks being described as coward punches, did that help to reduce their incidence? Calling riding in a stolen car a joyride, does that give encouragement to people to go and seek a bit of joy? Things like that.
Well, interestingly enough, I've just with some colleagues finished a study looking at the drop in assault and how much of it was attributable to the lockout laws and how much of it was attributable to other factors. And one of the things we found was that the starting point for the drop in assault wasn't actually the lockout laws. Certainly it dropped dramatically after the lockout laws. The starting point was actually the death of Daniel Christie. If you look at it on a daily basis, the turning point was the death of Daniel Christie. So this is a long-winded answer to your question. I'm not sure the naming matters. I'm not saying for a minute we should call it joyriding, just for the same reason that department stores don't want to call it shoplifting, they want to call it theft. But I think people underestimate the importance of what I'd call signal events. Port Arthur massacre, the death of Daniel Christie, these events that happen which change people's perception of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. So I think you're onto something here, but when it comes to giving you more evidence than that, I don't have much to offer. You are right on the money.
The question is about...
You're not right on the money.
Yeah, well, you will be in a minute. The question is about police targeting particular types of offending, for example, domestic violence and related matters, and particular police programs that are instituted for that purpose.
Yes, you're right on the money. No, the runaway charge that's getting people into prison is intimidation stroke stalking. Certainly some contribution from breaching apprehended violence orders, but there's been a huge increase in both the number of people arrested for intimidation stalking and the likelihood of going to jail for intimidation stalking. So that's pushed it up a lot. Whether that's because it's easier to prove intimidation stalking than it is to prove breach of AVO or what Nick would know. I know the penalties are quite severe for that, and police are quite judicious in what they charge. And I also suspect some of the intimidation is internet-style, mobile phone intimidation. So, you know, if you can tape that or tap that, you've got the evidence laid down in front of you. Whereas, you know, with a breach of AVO, sometimes it's going to, Nick would know more about this than me, but sometimes it's going to be someone say, he did this, and there's a question of gathering evidence that that is actually what happened. Would that be right, Nick?
Absolutely. You're always right, Don. That's why it's always such a pleasure to talk to you. And the thing about Don is that being such an accomplished statistician, although he seems to have fallen into that job in the early days, everything he says is evidence-based.
Oh, I don't know about that. My wife wouldn't agree with you about that.
Well, I'm not talking about those sorts of things. Well, we're reaching the end of our time, unfortunately. We'll take one more question, if we may.
Well,
Don has his crystal ball out to see what's going to happen in the future.
look, all I can tell you is that COVID reduced crime, blessing, but things are going back to normal rapidly. If I had to take a punt, I would say it's all on fraud. Fraud is, the more we use the internet, the more scope there is for fraudulent transactions. But honestly, I don't think criminology has advanced to the point where you could make any sensible judgment about. If you'd said to me, what's going to happen to robbery, I'd say, oh, it's gone for good. But now people seem to have found a way of making money out of robbery, with the cards or whatever else they're managing to do with it. So I don't have anything useful to say about what the future holds. Nick, with his long experience, would have a pretty clear idea where we're going.
No, I'm not going into the future. That's just too risky for any of us. But there's obviously some good news. There are some crimes that are continuing. And I say that as a former prosecutor because I'd like my colleagues to remain employed. But it is the case that drug trafficking and use has not fallen. Theft from a retail store, particularly alcohol.
Yes, although the COVID knocked the stuffing out of that for a while.
Yeah. Fraud and extortion, as you've heard from Don. Identity theft. All these computer-assisted fraudulent offences that can be committed. And regrettably, domestic violence has not fallen.
No, it hasn't. In fact, this is a big surprise because non-domestic assault has come down. And I was one of those who thought if only we could reduce the alcohol consumption, domestic violence would fall. But it didn't, and it hasn't. Now, whether that's because there's more reporting is hard to say because the national surveys don't give you a clear enough picture. But it is surprising to me that there hasn't been a drop in domestic assault.
We obviously need very wide education campaigns to change men, I think, before we're going to see much progress in that area. But there are a lot of people working on it at government and non-government levels, and hopefully there'll be some progress in times to come. Well, we've reached the end of our time, unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen. So would you please join me in thanking Don for his contribution. Now, I have to give you these final housekeeping instructions. Don will be available, I don't know whether he knows this yet, but he will be available to sign copies of his book don't go away, opposite the State Library bookshop, which is next to the Library Cafe. The bookshop's in the Macquarie Street building. A volunteer will show you the way. You can either go through the library or out into the street, in which case you have to check in again. So make your... Books will be available as well, by the way. Pardon? Your books will be available as well. My books? Oh, wow. Thank you. I better stick around then. A final announcement, please. We all have to leave this room now because now that we've sullied it, it has to be cleaned. So enjoy the festival, and thank you very much for your attendance.